This is a photo of one of Beijing's main avenues taken in 1978, and here is a photo of the same avenue 4 decades later. During this period, China has completely transformed, moving from one of the countries dominated by poverty and misery to becoming the world's second-largest economy, with analysts saying it could eventually become the first. There are countless symbols in the country that illustrate this transformation, such as the vast, high-speed rail network and the modern skyscrapers. But perhaps the streets are the most emblematic. Bicycles, which were once the main means of transportation for the population, have largely been replaced by over 415 million cars, completely changing the urban landscape. In just over 3 decades, China went from selling around 5,000 vehicles per year to becoming the world's largest automotive market, now selling more than 20 million annually. This massive market, which opened up in the 1980s, attracted automakers from all over the world, with brands like Ford, Volkswagen, Toyota, Peugeot, and General Motors establishing themselves in China. For decades, these companies sold millions of vehicles, earning billions of dollars and making huge profits. However, it seems this golden period is coming to an end. Chinese automakers are becoming increasingly competitive, and foreign automakers are facing losses, and even reconsidering their presence in the Asian giant. How did China turn from a dream into a nightmare for the world's biggest automakers? If you want to know the answer, just watch this video, because today we'll expand our global knowledge about China and the automotive industry. On February 21, 1972, then US President Richard Nixon and chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, Mao Zedong, shook hands in a historic moment captured in a photograph. More than just a meeting between two leaders, this handshake symbolized the rapprochement of two worlds. In the previous decades, the United States had recognized Taiwan as the only China, and relations with Communist China were virtually non-existent. The rapprochement began around 1970, and after almost 2 years of negotiations, the meeting between the two leaders finally took place. Although the objective of the meeting was entirely political, with the United States seeking to weaken the Soviet Union in Asia and China seeking international recognition over Taiwan, the leaders' meeting also served to strengthen trade relations between the two nations. Mao Zedong passed away 4 years later, and his successor, Deng Xiaoping, took advantage of the path opened by Mao and further strengthened relations with the United States, especially in trade matters. While Richard Nixon was the first sitting U.S. president to visit China, Deng Xiaoping was the first Chinese supreme leader to set foot in American territory. With the rapprochement and reforms promoted by Deng, many companies, both American and from U.S. allied countries, began to establish themselves in China. Among them were car manufacturers, who saw the first opportunities in the Chinese giant in the 1980s. The vast majority of companies setting up in China were looking for cheaper labor to produce goods to be sold worldwide. However, automakers were after something different. They were eyeing the vast Chinese domestic market, as China was then the most populous country in the world, with streets dominated by bicycles. However, unlike in the rest of the world, automakers couldn't simply set up operations in China and start building factories. The Chinese government imposed a main rule: the formation of joint ventures with Chinese companies. In these partnerships, foreign companies could not hold more than half of the shares, and were required to transfer technology and the knowledge necessary for vehicle production to their Chinese partners. The first automaker to accept this model and set foot in China was American Motors Corporation, AMC, from the United States, the owner of the Jeep brand. AMC, then the fourth largest U.S. automaker, created a joint venture with Beijing Automotive Industry Corporation in 1983. Just a year later, Volkswagen followed suit, partnering with Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation, now known as SAIC. As the years passed and China's astounding economic growth continued, almost all the world's major automakers entered the local market, which became a veritable El Dorado. General Motors, for example, arrived in 1997 through a joint venture with SAIC, which already had a partnership with Volkswagen. In just over a decade, GM captured about 14% of the Chinese market, with annual profits surpassing $2 billion. At times, the confidence was so high that, according to a former GM executive who led the company's operations in Indonesia, his colleagues bragged that China was the company's eternal profit machine. But how long did it take for them to realize they were wrong? The environment the automakers found upon arrival in China was ideal. Deng Xiaoping's reforms were beginning to yield results. And in just the 1980s, China's GDP doubled, with an average annual growth rate close to 10%. Besides the favorable economic environment, there was a situation every businessman or executive hopes for: unmet demand. For decades, only Communist Party authorities were allowed to own vehicles in China. According to a 1985 article, there was only one car for every 6 million inhabitants in China. Meanwhile, Chinese automakers faced image issues, even domestically, as potential consumers preferred the well-known international brands entering the market. The first model Volkswagen produced in China was the Santana, a familiar sight to the Brazilian public, which became one of the most popular cars on Chinese streets, with over 10,000 units manufactured in just the first year. Even as Chinese companies released blatant, cheaper copies of major foreign models, consumers continued to prefer the original versions. The Volkswagen Santana, for instance, remained in production for nearly 2 decades, sold over 3 million units, and became one of the best-selling vehicles in China of all time. The same can be said for other brands like Buick from General Motors and Toyota, which were favored by Chinese buyers for years. The major turning point for automakers began quietly in the early years of this century, interestingly, in the United States. After several years of development, an almost unknown American company delivered the first Tesla Roadster electric sports car in 2008. Although other companies were simultaneously working on electric vehicles, it's undeniable that the success of Elon Musk's Tesla changed global perceptions about electric cars and opened the door for the sector's largest transformation in recent decades. Chinese automakers were the ones who best capitalized on the path Tesla paved. In the combustion vehicle market, even with partnerships and technology transfers, Chinese automakers were still far behind the major companies in the industry. However, in the electric vehicle market, almost all companies were starting from scratch, with some showing little to no interest in joining the competition. By then, China already had a few companies like BYD that were developing electric vehicles, though without much impact. The Chinese government also saw electric cars as a way to develop a strong automotive industry and address other national issues, such as oil dependency and pollution. According to an MIT publication, in 2009, when fewer than 500 electric vehicles were sold in China, the government launched a subsidy plan for local companies to produce electric vehicles. Over the next 13 years, the government spent more than $20 billion on subsidies and tax exemptions to encourage the production and sale of electric vehicles, the publication reports. The Chinese government's decision to go all in on electric vehicle development was both ambitious and risky, but it was the only real opportunity for the country to develop companies capable of competing with giants from Japan, the United States, and Germany. Investments began, coincidentally, the same year China overtook the United States to become the world's largest automotive market, with over 13 million vehicles sold. While sales declined worldwide, the Chinese market became a lifeline for automakers like Toyota and General Motors, and, according to The Guardian, the biggest market for Volkswagen. In their euphoria, it seems, executives at these automakers failed to see in their rearview mirrors that Chinese companies were closing in. Electric vehicle sales, which represented only 0.01% of the market in 2010, exceeded 14% in 2022, according to Statista.com. In 2023, that figure was close to 20%, meaning that 1 in every 5 vehicles sold globally was electric. No country sells as many electric cars as China. which holds just under 60% of the global electric vehicle market. At this point, the roles from decades ago have completely reversed, with Chinese brands far ahead of competitors, even in terms of consumer preference. Decades of partnerships between Chinese and foreign automakers have helped improve the quality of Chinese cars. According to a Stanford University study, the model adopted by the Chinese government has benefited local companies, mainly through two channels: worker mobility and the use of suppliers. Researchers found that about 27% of employees who changed jobs moved from a joint venture to Chinese-controlled companies. Many of these job changes involved engineers, designers, and other high-tech professionals, facilitating knowledge transfer across companies. Additionally, many Chinese automakers that formed partnerships with foreign companies started using the same suppliers in other production lines, which helped to increase the quality of vehicles. The study indicates that, as a result, in 2003, for every 100 cars produced, 508 defects were detected, a number reduced to 123 by 2014. Some Chinese companies also acquired foreign automakers, gaining access to new technologies. A notable example is Geely, which acquired the Swedish company Volvo in 2010. Volvo, known for having one of the best reputations in the industry and for manufacturing some of the world's safest vehicles, enabled Geely to access the latest advancements in the automotive market and improve its own models. All these factors, combined with government subsidies, have led more Chinese consumers to choose local brands, creating a major headache for traditional automakers. General Motors, which once saw China as an endless source of profit, saw its market share drop from nearly 15% in 2015 to less than 9% last year, along with registering losses. Volkswagen, on the other hand, lost its position as the top-selling brand in China to BYD. According to CNN, without its Chinese revenue, the company may have to close factories in Germany for the first time in history. For Japanese automakers, the situation is similar. Toyota is also experiencing a decline in sales, and Mitsubishi has already indicated it will end its business in the country. According to Bloomberg, the share of foreign automakers in the Chinese market fell from 61% in 2020 to 41% last year. Despite this discouraging scenario, some experts argue that international automakers should persist in the Chinese market. However, indications suggest the situation may worsen. Like a strategic game with meticulously calculated moves, the Chinese government has leveraged the world's largest automotive market and the rise of electric vehicles to strengthen its local industry. With support from domestic operations, Chinese automakers have gained strong momentum to expand into territories once dominated by brands like Ford, Volkswagen, and Toyota. A study by consultancy firm Alex Partners predicts that by the end of this decade, Chinese automakers will account for 1 in every 3 global sales in the sector. The forecast is that by 2030, around 9 million vehicles manufactured in China will be shipped abroad. This outlook is putting almost every automaker in the world at a crossroads. Some experts believe companies losing money in China should abandon their business in the country. In a statement, John Murphy, the lead automotive analyst at Bank of America, said that major American automakers should exit China as soon as possible and focus on markets where they can be profitable. On the other hand, Warren Brown, a former GM executive who worked at the company for 4 decades, believes that abandoning the world's largest market is not an option and advocates adaptation as a solution. Exiting the Chinese market today might help companies cut their losses, but leaving Chinese automakers alone in the world's largest market could be like feeding a monster that will eventually try to overtake all its competitors. One thing is certain, the days when a Chinese company needed to partner with a foreign one to avoid being squeezed out of its own market are long gone. The government has even lifted the requirement for foreign automakers to form joint ventures to sell in China. Today, the barriers for any foreign automaker establishing itself in China are market-based rather than government-imposed. But that doesn't mean the era of partnerships is over. They've just evolved. Unable to compete with Chinese manufacturers, traditional automakers are now partnering with them to avoid being left out of the future. Volkswagen, for example, bought a 5% stake in XPeng for $700 million and entered a joint venture for the joint development of vehicles. Stellantis, the world's fourth largest automaker, which owns brands like Fiat, Jeep, and Citroën, acquired a stake in China's Leapmotor and will start selling the brand's vehicles in new countries. For now, automakers are resisting as best they can. Some, such as the American ones, are even relying on help from the US government, which is imposing barriers on Chinese electric vehicles. The big question is, how long will this last? And do you think Chinese automakers will really outpace the big brands outside China? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, I'm sure you'll like this one on the automotive industry in the former Soviet Union, now appearing on your screen. Thanks so much for watching up to here. Take care and see you in the next video.